What's going on, everyone, and welcome back to Jam with Jock. Today we're going to look at 3 essential mixing tips for beginners. As a beginner producer, I don't think mixing needs to be at the top of your list on things to work on. But in saying that, I still think there's some fundamental techniques to learn and understand at the beginning of your producer journey. So today we're going to be looking at 3 of those techniques, and I think they're going to go a long way in making your track sound more professional. So let's get straight into it. So I've made a loop for today's lesson, and with a lot of sounds that I think are going to emphasize the points that I'm going to be trying to make. And I've also got 3 different versions of that loop. So I've got an unmixed version, a mixed one, which we're going to do step by step together, and then an overmixed one. And this is going to be really important to look and listen to at the end, because you absolutely can overmix something. And as a beginner, I think you can get in that headspace of trying to do too much. So stick around to the end, because that's going to be key in hearing how you can actually overdo it. So first we'll play the unmixed version. As a beginner, you may think that sounds fine, but as we go through the layers one by one and we work on how to improve them, you're going to notice a difference at the end. Now, before we look at the first technique, I just want to make a point very clear. 80% of your mix is volume. So by having your individual channels at the right volume, that's going to be doing most of the work for you. And as a beginner, that's going to be far more important than any VST or effect can do for your mix. So the first thing you want to think about is the style of track you're making. So this one is quite dancey, very housey. So because this is a dance record, the kick needs to be the loudest point in the mix. So if you go into session view by pressing tab, this is the session view here, we can start to look at our levels. We want our kick to be the loudest, and at the moment it's -7.93. Nothing else is overpowering that. So that's exactly where we want to start. We want the kick to be the loudest point of the mix, and then we want to almost rank our other elements to where we want them. So snare is very important in house music. And this 909 classic house sound is also going to be really important to not be too low in the mix. Got our bass at -15, and then toms and pads are definitely sounds that you can have lower in your mix. So getting this right from the start is absolutely essential. So the first technique we're going to be looking at today is EQ. This is one of the most important tools you can use when mixing, as it's going to help your sounds not clash together. The most important frequency range to not have sounds clashing is in the low end. If you can clear space for your bass and other low-end instruments, it's going to go a long way in helping your track sound really clean. So by pulling up an EQ onto the kick, we don't want to take a lot of weight and depth out of the kick. By putting the frequencies around 100 Hertz, you'll notice it gets very thin. So I usually have my kick at 50 Hertz. That means the frequencies from 0 to 50 Hertz are being cleared up, but I'm still getting enough low end to help that kick punch through the mix. And for a house record track, that's exactly what you need. You need that kick to be punching. If we take a look at the snare now, you'll notice that there's a lot of frequencies between 0 and 100 Hertz. So what we need to do is we need to clear a lot of those frequencies away by using our filter EQ. And I like to do anywhere from 80 to 150 Hertz for the snare. That way we're clearing a lot of space for the kick and the bass, but we're not losing the impact that the snare has and we want to have. A lot of the time people want to EQ way too much of the low end and the mid-range out of our hi-hat because they think it's a high frequency sound, so therefore I need to be taking all of that space out. But I don't think that's the case, especially in house songs with the 909 being one of the more recognizable sounds. If you're taking too much of the frequencies out, just like when we did it to the snare or the kick, it's just losing a lot of presence, and we want this to be somewhere in that mid-range. Anywhere between 250 and 500 Hertz I would do. That way we're not losing the impact that we want this open hi-hat to have. Next we're going to EQ our tom. Once again, you can see lots of frequencies between 0 and 100 Hertz, and toms can be really tricky to mix because they're in that same spectrum as kicks and bass. What we're going to do is we're going to take it up to about 150 Hertz. And for the same reasoning as the snare and the hat, we don't want it to compete with the kick and bass frequencies, but we also don't want to make it too thin either. We look at the pad frequencies now. There's not too many low frequencies that would be clashing with the kick and bass, but I always like to do it for good measure anyway. So we go up to 150 Hertz and just visually see that we're cutting off at the point of where the sound starts to get really loud and where a lot of its presence is. But we're removing a lot of those lower frequencies just in case they were going to be clashing with the kick and the bass. So there are far more techniques that we can look at with EQing, but I think as a beginner, you just want to be focusing on clearing those lower frequencies for the kick and the bass, because once you have toms and other drum elements or synths or pads clashing with the bass, it's going to sound extremely muddy. And just by simply removing those lower frequencies, it's going to make your track sound a lot better because the lower frequencies aren't becoming clashed together. Technique number 2 is panning. Panning is when you put your sounds to the left or right, and this is one of the best ways that you can help give your sounds an individual space in the overall mix. So if every sound was hitting directly in the middle, then sounds that either sound similar or sit in that same frequency range are going to start clashing with one another, even if we've EQ'd the low end and done everything else right. Toms can be a fantastic sound to try and pan because, as I said at the start, they can be really tricky sounds to mix. So by panning it hard to the left or right, we're creating its own space, and it's going to sound a lot clearer than if it was coming straight down the middle with the kick or snare. So I'll just play the drums by themselves. Because we don't want the tom to be the main element, such as the kick or the snare or the hi-hat, by panning it to the left, we've still got the sound to add to the groove, but it's not trying to take over the sounds that we really want to be hearing, and that's the kick and the snare and the hat. You don't always need to pan things hard left or hard right. You can also pan things quite subtly. So what I like to do with hats is I just like to pan them the other way to what I've panned something just ever so subtly. It's just clearing up a little bit of that stereo image for the kick and snare, which really need to be coming straight down the middle. Also use things like Auto Pan by Ableton, which is a fantastic way to automate the width going from left to right. So there's some good presets within Auto Pan where you could do slow and steady. You can hear the pad. Slow down the rate. If you've got headphones on, you'll hear how just ever so subtly it's going from left to right. And that's not only a great way to give your track lots of movement, but also clear spaces in the frequency ranges as well. So panning is an extremely effective way to give your sounds their own little space. And I definitely would experiment with putting sounds all the way to the left or right, and then around that midway point, and then even ever so subtly too, like I've done to the hat. This is a fantastic technique to learn as a beginner to make your sounds have their own little space in the mix. The third technique we're going to be looking at today is sidechaining. If you're making any kind of electronic music or dance record, this is the most important thing you can learn. Let me break down exactly what sidechaining is. So we'll need a compressor to do this. You can put it there, and if we hit this bar here, we'll get the sidechain button here. We turn that on. We need to select our input, so we want that coming from the kick. Okay, sidechain on, audio from the kick, very important. And then we're going to be pressing this graph bar here. And so what sidechaining is doing is it's taking the audio from the kick. Now, every time that kick hits, this pad or whatever other element I choose to have this effect on, it's going to duck. And what that's going to do is help the kick punch through the mix. And that's why I said any dance record track, this is the most important thing to know. Because if you create space by sidechaining your bass or pad around the kick, it's going to make that kick a driving force in the track. So we've got our sidechain on our pad. We're going to drag the threshold down. I'll turn off the pan so you can hear what it's doing clearly. As you could see, as I reduced the threshold, you could see the gain reduction bar here getting bigger. And what that gain reduction is, it's showing how much signal it's ducking by. And in most cases, you don't want it to be too obvious. So we're about minus 20 dB. That's a great level to be in because it's not changing the overall sound of the pad, but it's doing a really big job ducking just enough to let that kick really punch through. So I love doing it with pads, strings, anything long that is like sustained. It's a really good job to have that ducking motion. And then bass is absolutely essential to have a sidechain on because as we looked at the start, that frequency range, and we didn't really take much off the kick. So that means a lot of the bass and kick frequencies are playing together. So by having a sidechain on the bass, it's going to be doing exactly what it was for the pad, and that's just going to be ducking when that kick plays. So again, we'll hit this bar, turn on sidechain, audio coming from the kick, and then pulling down this threshold just to where we see enough gain reduction that we like. I liked it when it was reducing a bit more than the pad, so I'm happy to have it at minus 30 dB. There's also tools that automate the sidechaining process for you, so you don't need to use a compressor, and so it shapes the volume for you. So I'll just delete that compressor on the pad. As you can see, it's ducking that first volume, so that's where the kick's going to be hitting. So these can be great plugins to use and nice and easy because all I did was drag this plugin in. And it's essentially creating the exact same thing as the compressor was doing. So whether you're compressing using a sidechain or whether you're using some plugins like this to do it for you, it's definitely one of the most essential things you can do in dance music to help that kick really stand out and punch through without having any of these other frequencies clashing with it. All right, so now we've mixed this version. Let's go ahead and listen to the unmixed and then the mixed version. So hopefully you could hear the difference there, that especially this tom, having that in its own space in the left, I think made a huge difference. And also this pad with a bit of ducky motion and also that auto pan going from left to right did a really good job in helping the sounds be really clear in the overall mix. So if we have a look at the over mixed version now, we'll notice that by taking too much frequencies out or ducking signal too much with the sidechain, you can actually overmix something and make it sound worse than it was originally. The open hi-hat lost a lot of its power. Sounds very thin. Pad. You can hear the ducking more than you hear the pad itself, and that's not what we want. We want the pad to duck ever so slightly when the kick's hitting, but we don't want that to be the distinctive sound that we hear from the pad. So remembering to set your volumes to where they need to be at the start and having the elements that you want to be the loudest in the mix at that loudness level. So going into your session view and visually seeing where things stand and getting that right from the start is going to do 80% of the work for you. And then using these three techniques of EQ, panning, and sidechain compression, it's going to really help improve the sound quality of your tracks as a beginner producer. But like I said from the start, this doesn't need to be your main focus. So just understanding that the most important frequencies to clear is that low end with just a simple EQ sweep is all I'd recommend you learn and know at the beginning of your producer journey. And don't try and do too much. I know as a beginner, you want to try and look like you know what you're doing and just emphasize EQs or effects to try and make a more polished sound. But a lot of the time you're actually harming the sound more than improving it. So just do subtle changes and don't do anything just for the sake of it, only when it has a specific purpose. Thank you so much for staying to the end of the video. I really appreciate it. I know this can be quite a tricky topic, so if there's any questions, I'd love to answer them for you. If you learned something, I'd love if you could hit that like and subscribe button. I'll be posting here weekly, so there's lots more to come. If you wanted to keep watching my stuff, you can go and check out my latest upload by clicking up there. Until then, I'll see you guys in the next one.